In this video, we'll be discussing DevSuite requirements management and best practices in regards to form design, and specifically the ability to have custom forms, or called smart screens, based on the spec type. So in the DevSpec admin, within the settings for workflow spec type settings, you'll notice that you have different spec types. You may have specifications, requirements, and maybe any additional types that you have broken it down into. We'll use these as examples for this demonstration, but you may want to have a different screen or GUI design for specifications as opposed to requirements. To design those screens, once you have defined your spec types, you go into the Spec GUI Design GUI Settings, Spec Description page, and you'll expand that out and you'll see there is something called Overwrite. Within Overwrite, you essentially have two different versions of that spec page. One is called hardware specs and one is called software specs in this example. If you were to create an additional one, you would just click on that right-click on spec description. Right-click on Overwrite, click Add New Page, and then you would get an additional new page. Let's call this, for example, Spec 2. And once you've created that new page, you can see that we have hardware specs, software specs, and Spec 2. From this, you follow the same form design concept to add your fields and your field placement for that specific page based on that spec type. To do the mapping of which page will appear based on the spec type, you simply go to the top the spec description page, and you'll see a section on the top where it says Overwrite option. You want to make sure you have the option selected to be can overwrite. If you have it set to no overwrite, it means that you will not have the option to create different types of specs based on the spec type. Once you have can overwrite selected, you would do your mapping of your type to the page. So for example, we have a spec type and we're mapping that to software specs. So I click on the right page name, I get a choice of what pages I have available to map to that type. So in this example, we had it set to software specs, but for this demonstration, I'll change it to hardware specs. Requirements, you have default. Wherever it's set to default, it'll just use your default spec page design that you have here and not use the overwrite page. In this example for requirements, I'm going to leave it to be default, but I've gone ahead and I've changed the spec to hardware specs. Then, when you go to submit a specification and create a new specification, it will use that type based on the type you've selected. It will use that page design mapping to the appropriate type.